I just like to welcome you all today and thank you very much for joining us. My name's Kathy and we have Alex from the Library Service joining as well too. And of course we have Paul Marynissen joining us. He's our Biosecurity Officer for Central Coast Council. Before we start, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I extend that respect to anyone joining us here today. First day of spring, absolutely fantastic, beautiful day out there and lots of people out getting into the garden during lockdown. But if it's anything like my garden, it hasn't coped very well over the neglected winter months, and I've got quite a few weeds in there. But lucky we've got Paul here today to run through identifying some weeds and how to get rid of them. So, and thank you to all those people who have put through some photos. So we've got lots of lovely photos there to share. And I'd like to just hand over to Paul now. Welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone, on this lovely first day of spring. Funnily enough, today I've been out doing inspections this morning. We're out looking for a new weed invasion. And sorry, I am at home, so there will be other noise in the background. I do apologise. And yes, it's first day of spring, and I don't know how the animals must know if they have a calendar or not, but I caught 2 rabbits today doing something that they do to get more rabbits. So I thought, well, that's very appropriate for today. I thought that was rather funny out the back of Calgary. So a little bit about me. My name is Paul Marynissen. I'm Council's Biosecurity Officer for Weeds, and I'm a horticulturalist by trade. I've been doing this as a weeds officer for coming up to 26 years, actually over 26 years now. And so I've pretty much seen a lot of different weeds, and we primarily deal with what used to be called noxious weeds. That's now ended because it's now called the Biosecurity Act. So they're now called priority weeds. And so we go out there, we inspect, we let people know what they've got, how to get rid of it. And then if they don't, then we have to go through enforcement, which we very rarely have to. Most people want to do the right thing and they get out there and they do some good work. Occasionally they don't, but we also advise and help people identify weeds that aren't priority. We tell them that, and quite often people send us things that are native as well. So we do like to try and help with things like that. So with no further ado, without further ado, I'm going to share, people have been sending in photos. So I'm going to bring them up on a PowerPoint, and the photos, we're going to show what the photos are, talk about what they are, and also a bit about control on them as well. So if you do have questions, please put them in the chat section and we'll get through them at the end, and we'll get onto these now. So bear with me, I don't use Zoom often, so I do apologise if things don't go quite right. Now I'm hoping that everyone is seeing a screen that says Weeds Wednesday, a virtual chat with a picture of a flower. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, good. Things are working then. I'm very glad. Okay, so we're going to talk about a bit of identification. Barbara sent this in and would like to know what this is. Now, what that is a plant called blue periwinkle. So called Vinca major. It is a weed. It scrambles along the ground, quite often some other things. You will often find this as a variegated variety as well. It can get very dense. It mats over the ground and will displace plants. It gets a little, for those of you that don't know, a periwinkle flower, 5 petals, a little flat sort of flower, about the size of say between a 20 and a 50-cent piece. And it does spread very rapidly, and it will spread by seeds and by runners. Best thing for that one is, when they're small like that, is get in there with a garden trowel and dig it out and throw it. You can throw, unless I say otherwise, you can take it as read that everything can go into the green bin, because I've been out to the facility and things do get very well composted at the end. You can't tell what's in there. It does get very hot. You wouldn't even be able to hold your hands in the pile. It gets that hot. So that one, if you've got larger amounts, it really does come down to, unfortunately, you having to use chemicals, because it's got such a root mass. There's quite a number of chemicals that can be used on it. I probably will refer to something today called Weedwise a fair bit. It's a state government, it's both an app and a website, and I'm pretty sure this one's on there. And what it does is it gives you what the plant is, how to identify it, if you have any obligations that you have to do if you've got these plants, but more importantly, it has different ways that you can control them and all the registered or permitted chemicals. So rather than going through them all, I would probably refer to those. If you can't find one of these things, I can always be contacted at weeds@Central Coast, which is a lot easier than trying to spell my last name in an email. So that one's called Vinca. It is fairly toxic to stock, so I wouldn't have it in paddocks where there's animals. They generally won't eat it unless you get to a point where there's a drought, and then the animals will start eating things they usually won't eat. Now, this next one is not normally seen like this. This is actually a very transitory position for this plant. People will often say to me when they describe this plant that it has red flowers with bits of black on it. What they're not realizing is it has yellow flowers, and what you're seeing here is actually the flower, but doesn't last on the plant long. But when people, what are usually seeing it is what's called the calyxes in the fruit. So this is, in fact, a plant called Mickey Mouse bush. Now, most people might not know it by this, but they may know it looking like that. Those black things there are the fruits, and the pale green ones are still unripe fruits. And the peak behind it is the bit that usually would cover the petals before the flower opens. They turn red, and that's what attracts the birds in, the bright red. And also, you've probably noticed a lot of weedy plants have blackberries, such as blackberries, lantana, quite a few of the asparagus as well. And that is actually quite a thing. The birds respond to the reflection from the black quite well. Now, this one, don't ever try pulling this out by hand unless the plant is only about 1 inch tall, because by the time the plants get to about 3 inches tall, 75 millimeters, they can have a root system that is over 1/2 meter deep already. If you try pulling out a plant that's more than, say, about 30 centimeters tall, you'll blow a foofer valve. That's an awful way to say it, but that's what's going to happen because it gets such a hard root system. What you're best off doing with this one is scraping up the side of the stem and applying undiluted glyphosate. Now, the other thing I want to say is that whenever you're using chemicals, read the label. The label is a legally binding document. So wear all the safety equipment. If they say to wear gloves when you're doing this, wear gloves when you're doing it. If they say to wear a mask, I think we're all used to that at the moment, wear a mask. So someone asked about what can cause dogs to get scratchy. Now, there are some grasses that will do it, but it's very hard to narrow it down. But this is the main culprit on the Central Coast. This is called trad, and it's commonly seen in shady areas, occasionally in sunny but damp areas. Now, the reason it causes itchiness in dogs is pretty much all dogs are allergic to it, and they seek it out, particularly in warm weather. Short dogs, if they walk through it, it'll just get on them. But most of the time what happens is in hot weather, dogs will go seek it out because it's quite a cool plant because it's got so much water in it. They will go over and they will splay their legs and flop down in it. And unfortunately, anyone who has dogs will know that when they splay out their legs, all that the areas where there's not a lot of hair and it's quite a lot of just bare skin gets exposed, and that's where it starts, between there, down in the groin, under here, under the chin, but also between the paws. And that is going to cause quite a bit of problem for the dogs. Best way of getting rid of this, if you can do it, chickens. Chickens love this stuff like you wouldn't believe. They will scratch it out. You get big eggs. It's actually a high protein plant, believe it or not. And it's got what's called carotenoids. If you've ever seen this plant die, it gets quite a yellowy leaf before it dies. That's the actual true color of the leaf that's being masked by chlorophyll when we see it as being green. Now, the chickens will eat that, and they will also turn that carotenoids, the yellow in the leaf, into the most vivid colored yolks you've ever seen in your life. It's really amazing. Like, I'm talking the color of my shirt can be when you make hollandaise sauce. It looks artificial. I've done this. But apart from that, raking, if you can get in and rake it, that gets a lot of it out. And after that, there are some chemicals you can use. Once again, I refer to weed-wise because there's quite a few different ones, and it comes down to your situation of where you are, of what you're going to use. It's very hard to give a one solution fits all for some of these weeds. Blake asks us about this one. Now, you've probably seen this if you've driven along some areas where there's wet and drains along the side of the road or on the edges of wetlands, because this thing loves water. That's the Arum Lily. Also, people do call them funeral lilies, and they are fairly common. They get a berry that gets quite red, and that's another common colour for berries that attract birds, and it has an affinity for water areas. If you are going to control this one, you can mattock them out, but whatever you do, wear long sleeves and wear gloves. Many people are pretty badly allergic to this plant. It contains some chemicals that can cause burns. So whenever you're dealing with anything like this, cover up as much as possible. Definitely wear good gloves. Try to avoid leather gardening gloves. I've actually seen the sap on this soak through the leather and still cause people problems. I would strongly recommend with this one, PVC coated gloves. They're the ones that are made out of, look like made out of material that have been dipped in plastic, and they're fairly cheap at hardware shops and nurseries. And I would wear those because they're chemically impervious. Once again, weed-wise, there are some chemicals you can use, but I'm really a bit wary about using chemicals on this one because it usually is growing very close to water, and the chemicals that do work on this, you don't want getting in water. So I would probably say that if you can, it would be to mattock them out. Mike asked about this one. Now, I should have mentioned before, some of you may have heard me before on ABC with Scott Levi once a month, or on ABC on Sydney with Simon Marnie. I go on there about every couple of weeks. I was on this weekend. I was called with about a minute's notice to go on there as well. And this is my my mortal enemy, and Simon knows this and often brings it up because I've explained it many times. This is onion weed. Now, onion weed is a couple of different plants called onion weed, but this one is the one that we regionally know as onion weed. Gets a large bulb, but off the bottom of those bulbs, you'll see down the bottom there near the weeding tool, those roots. And you'll quite often find underground little fine roots going off from those with little tiny bulblets on the end. When you pull the parent plant out, that can quite often trigger those small ones to start, and you'll end up seeming like pulling out one and then later on pulling out 10 and going from there. It also does get seeds. It gets little white flowers on the end of a long stalk. They can be fragrant at times, and they will drop many seeds, and then you'll have those coming up as well. So a couple of things you can do to control this one. If possible, where you've got it, is before you mulch, put down 8 layers of newspaper, wetting every second layer till you completely get it all covered, and then put the mulch over the top. Generally, I would say don't use anything less than 4 to 5 inches of mulch. So what's that, up to 12.5 centimeters or so of mulch. Anything less than that is really just, it's for appearances. It's not going to really work as mulch. So what I'd say is you do that, then don't disturb that area. This works for oxalis as well. Don't disturb the area for a minimum of a year. Maybe then do a little test patch, open it up, see if anything sprouts, and if it doesn't, go ahead and start using it. But during that time, you're going to exhaust the bulbs as they try to come up, but can't get through the newspaper. The newspaper is good because it allows moisture to go through and still keep the ground alive and keep the bugs alive. And it also allows air to exchange, but not light. Now, if anyone remembers back in the 70s when the big thing was to put down black plastic covered with river stones, if anyone's ever then gone through afterwards after a few years and decided to change the look of the garden, pulled the river stones out and pulled up the black plastic, underneath was a dead zone. We're talking no microbes, no insects, no worms, dry. That's why we don't use black plastic. Weed mat, people do use that, but I hear more people cursing it than they do loving it. And the reason is because it's woven, a lot of these plants can actually get between the weaves and push up. And then when you try to pull the weed mat or the weed out, it starts lifting the weed mat. It becomes a tangled mess. The newspaper is good because it's more of a solid barrier. Even though it's only soft, it does really work. And the other benefit of is that over time, when it does break down, it just becomes humus in the ground, just becomes organic matter. Whereas the weed mat being plastic is going to be always there unless you go through and pull out every last bit. And that's not pleasant. I've done plenty of jobs when I used to be a gardener doing that as well. So try to avoid that. If you have it already, you can, don't try not to pull it out. I recommend, there's a video on Council's Facebook page. It's one of the first videos that was ever put up as Central Coast Council. I think it was the first. It's also, I have a Facebook page called Paul the Weeds Guy. It's on there as well. And I talk about how to make something called sponge tongs. Now, sponge tongs are as simple as it sounds. It's a pair of tongs. Generally, try to buy the longer barbecue tongs that are longer than the usual kitchen tongs. You buy yourself a sponge, those scourers that have got the green scour on one side, yellow sponge on the other. Cut it in half, glue the green scour side to the inside of the tong so that when you close them, you've got two yellow sponge sides facing one another. What you then do is mix up glyphosate, wearing gloves, and glyphosate, half water, half glyphosate. I also recommend, if you can, throw a bit of food colouring, a bit of red food colouring. It helps you to see where you've been and you don't do the same ones twice. And the benefit of using this is you dip in to the chemical, squeeze off the excess so you don't get drips. Then you reach and then you get both sides of all the leaves at the same time and gently pull upwards. And by doing that, you're coating both sides of the leaf at the same time. You're getting all of them. You're not having to do them individually. You're also not getting overspray. You're not going to kill plants or the grass around there. That's going to go down at a good concentrate, get into the roots and kill those side bulbs. You will have some seeds over time that are going to regerminate, but you'll be able to keep on top of those as well. The other benefits of sponge tongs are, if it's in amongst plants, you can get down in amongst the plants, so you're not going to be spraying or touching anything, and then you get inside and just gently pull up like that. It works on a lot of weeds. If they're weeds that are softer but have got small leaves instead of the scrappy type leaves, instead of pulling up like that, what you do is just go pad, pad, pad as you go up the plant, and you're treating the whole thing in one go. It's a lot less chemical that's being used. You've got less chance of it overspraying or getting on you, and it's being targeted specifically. Another great tool like that you can buy that is very handy for doing weeds in the garden, same sort of thing. The brushes that you buy for doing the washing up, usually, the ones that you have the hollow handle that you flip on top or you unscrew, you put usually your detergent in the handle. You can do the same thing with half glyphosate, half water. Make sure before you do this, you very clearly get a text and write on it, poison, glyphosate, so that you don't mix it up in the future or someone else doesn't mix it up and try to do the washing up with it, because unfortunately things happen. So do that, keep it out in the garden. And what you can do with those is they're really good for patting onto weeds if you've got individual ones in the lawn, so you're not doing overspraying. It's really, really good on doing a plant called pennywort, the one that looks like lily pads that grows in the lawn. You see it near the beach and around the lakes and comes up in the gardens. It's got a really waxy leaf coating. This one, the scourer scratches that leaf coating, which usually is quite resistant to a lot of chemicals, and then puts the chemical on at the same time. And you just go one at a time, little scuff, move on to the next one. And it's very effective. My sister, who used to live across the road from me, wiped it entirely out of her lawn and garden doing that method. And she's now moved away about 8 years ago, still hasn't come back. It's very effective. We'll move on to the next one. Also, I should have told you, they're onion weed. Now, Catherine has asked a couple of these things. This is Simon Marnie's pet hate weed. Those red flowers you can see sticking up are coming from the ones that are on the other side of there. And that one is got a couple of different names, but the one that we generally call it is Parrot Flower. It's also called New Zealand Christmas Bells, Peruvian Lilies, which is closer to it because it's actually from Peru. They're not from New Zealand. It's a weed in New Zealand as well. They get masses of these water-filled little bulbs under the ground, which is where the plants are coming up from. And they can take a long time to get rid of. Really not fun. Preferably what you do in this case is crush them down. Put on a good pair of garden and work boots, crush them down flat in the ground, and then you use the newspaper trick I was mentioning before. 8 layers of newspaper, wetting every second layer, make sure they all overlap nicely. Mulch heavily with this one if you can. Go up to about 25 centimeters of mulch if possible, but otherwise maybe even 20 centimeters, because this is going to take probably 2 to 3 years to exhaust out. Be careful when you're handling them as well, because she's holding them there with her bare hand, but they can cause some people to get skin irritation as well. And in the foreground of the photo where the flowers are showing, there's another little one there that I found today, a few spots. That's called Crofton weed. And that's got little trowel-shaped leaves, and it's just in the foreground. It's got dark stems. If you crush the leaves, they smell like carrot tops, which is really bad. because horses love carrots, and that plant is poisonous to horses. Some horses can go years living on it and eventually they'll die. Other horses sometimes overnight and they'll die. It's they don't know exactly what's in it that's causing it, but it causes them to huff, and then it causes fluid to build up around the heart, and eventually it can kill them. So that one there is called Parrot Flower. This next one, the one on the left, is the big plant, and there's a little bit of a couple of other things growing in front there, and that is Agave americana. And they get spikes down the sides of the leaves, but also a big giant spike on the end of the leaves. When you're working around this plant, the first thing I say is put on a pair of safety glasses, not just usual optical glasses. Put on a good pair of safety glasses that cover right around and the sides of your eyes. The reason is, if you're working alongside and a leaf is pointing towards you, it doesn't present a very big surface area to look at. And those spines can easily penetrate through skin, eyes, clothing, and they hurt. And you don't want to lose your eyesight because of this one. So wearing a good stout, anything that you usually wear for, say, whippersnipping, something like that, or power tools, if you're working around this plant, wear that for sure. Now, you can do paint with glyphosate, but the best thing you can do for these is to, wearing very thick garden gloves, is cut all the leaves off and then mattic out the base of the plant. It may take it to reshoot for a little while and dig them out, but they also will drop seeds when they do flower on a giant stalk that goes up. And these that you see, the little one being held there on the leaf, they're the babies that result from it. And so that's Agave americana. Next one we have over here is Blackberry, Rubus. Now, it says there, people don't really get what they say, that's Rubus fruticosus, and that's that agsp means aggregate of species. And the reason is there are, last count, about 25 species of blackberries found in Australia. Now, they're all sometimes that hard to tell apart. So what they've grouped them into a thing called an aggregate of species, and the main one that they know of is Rubus fruticosus. We generally lump them all together and call them blackberries. They will sometimes differ in flavour or fruit size or even fruit colour, sometimes leaf colour. Some of them will have a very almost white underside to the leaves. Some of them have a lot darker leaves. Some have very chocolate brown stems. Some have, like this, have green stems. Oh, now rubbish people have just decided to come. One moment. Hopefully that makes a little less noise for everybody. It had to happen, didn't it? So with this one, this is a weed that is listed as priority. You're not allowed to sell the ones with thorns. You can buy legally thornless varieties of blackberries these days, but if it's got thorns, you're not allowed to propagate them, not allowed to sell them. We prefer it if you don't let it grow, or especially spread to a neighbour's property. You can pick and eat them, which is good because that actually then means the birds aren't getting them and the birds aren't spreading them. But the best thing for that is to do what's called scrape and paint, which is you scrape the stems and, wearing gloves, paint with a bit of glyphosate. And the reason for that is blackberries are like an iceberg. What you're seeing above ground is only a fraction of what's actually below ground in the roots and what's called the crown. So just cutting it back, it's just gonna keep sprouting back, and maybe even a bit thicker each time. So you need to get something down into the crowns. If you can get to that crown and dig it out, if it's a very small plant, by small I mean maybe a couple of stems only about, say, 2 to 3 foot long, you could dig that out, but otherwise it generally is going to need heavy equipment, because I've seen crowns on blackberry plants that come out the size of a washing machine, and it's an amazing thing to see. You wouldn't believe that this plant above ground has that much material below ground. And Morning Glory. Now, I can't say exactly which one this is. I'm guessing by looking at the leaf, it's probably purple Morning Glory, but there's also blue Morning Glory. But until it flowers, it's a bit hard to tell. These are also known as mile-a-minute vines, and there's a very good reason for that, because in summer, they seem to grow a mile a minute. They can easily grow a couple of inches per day. Best thing for these is to trace back to where the roots are and rip out as many of the roots as you can, and then deal with anything you can spray. There are quite a lot of sprays for it, but try to get out as much of the bulk as you can first. The exception to that is the pink or coastal Morning Glory, and the reason for that is they get tubers, and by pulling it out, you're getting less green that you can then use to get the chemical down into the root. That also spreads by seeds. It's mainly found near the beach, and it gets a much more finely divided leaf than this one, but it gets a pink flower. Now, believe it or not, in the same family of this is why you'll understand some get tubers. Sweet potato is actually a morning glory. It's just one that we cultivate, and if you ever see a sweet potato flower, you'll understand that it is actually a morning glory. I love this auto text because it just said, I said it's very disappointing. It said Monsters China. If anyone, I'm hoping people are getting a laugh out of this at least. Okay, so hopefully this is going to come up. The person thought that it looked a little bit like the native violet, and it's actually, I just wish I could share this, because it's a native and it's a type of hydrocotyle or pennywort, and it's got a name that I'm going to have to pardon my French because the common name is shitweed. And I do apologize, but that is the common name for it. And it's called that because quite often when it flowers, if you walk on it or brush it or anything, it smells like, well, what it's named after. And I have had people that have said that they've vomited when they've actually mown through it with the mower. And it doesn't always smell. That's the funny thing, is it only sometimes smells and other times not. So, oh, here we go. It's letting me share screen. I don't know why all of a sudden it's letting me. Here we go. There we go. That's it there. It's hydrocotyle laxiflora. Now, it generally will grow in shady areas, moist moist areas, maybe damp ground through gardens, and it just runs and runs and runs. Now, the main way to get rid of this is hand remove as much as possible and then mulch. And then from the mulch is to do the newspaper trick, but wear gloves. Some people do react to this one, other people not so much. And it does drop a lot of seed, unfortunately. So it could take you a little while, but hand removal and then mulching is probably the best control for this one. Can everyone see that? Good. Okay, that is called Paddy's lucerne. It's also known as Sida, S-I-D-A, rhombifolia, or rhomboidea, I should say. Now, this is a common weed, particularly in pastures that aren't being used an awful lot, urban areas, waste areas. It's spread by little tiny seeds. It's in the mallow family. And believe it or not, this can also be used to make a herbal remedy as a cough medicine. But it's one of these ones as well. Don't try pulling it out with bare hands, because one of two things are going to happen. Either you'll bust your back or it'll snap off, because some of them will sprout straight out of the ground. Others will come up straight out the ground, immediately do a right angle bend along parallel with the ground, and then grow up. And the idea is that if something comes along and tries to graze it and pulls on the plant, it will at that point snap, and then will then resprout from the roots. So your better one for that is either getting in there with a mattock and loosening it up, or scrape and paint with glyphosate. I keep coming back to glyphosate, but the reason is that there is the only systemic herbicide that is available to the public. Anything like vinegar or salt and vinegar, or the orange oils, or the pelargonic acids, or pine oils, they all work by desiccating the leaves. But if you were to paint it on the plant surface, it doesn't absorb in and doesn't move through to the roots. So the only one is glyphosate that is available to the public, and is systemic. And it's like I've said, there's a lot of toing and froing about it. All I always encourage people is to go out there and read independent scientific data, because there's a lot of people saying it's the devil, it's going to cause cancer, it's going to do this, and other people saying you can drink the stuff. I am in the middle of that. I don't believe you can drink it. I also don't believe that it's going to cause cancer. I believe that, like all chemicals, it should be treated with respect, follow the labels, use as little of it as possible, and just use it judiciously. Because in Australia, we have a lot of introduced plants. And if we're going to rely on just trying to hand remove all of them over a large scale, it's not feasible. We do need to use some heavier artillery, as it were. So that plant, I'll see if I can make that a bit bigger. So that's cider rhombifolia, also known as Paddy's lucerne. You generally tend to find there are a few butterflies and moths that eat it. Occasionally, the wallabies will have a chew on it, but generally cattle and all that won't touch it. They don't like it. Okay, so how do I do this to, here we go, and then I'll go stop sharing. I'll go back to the messages and have a look for, so did I, okay, I've done that one. How to get rid of stink horns. Kathy asked how to get rid of stink horns. The only way to do it, now this isn't guaranteed either, is to rake up all your leaf litter and mulch, because that's where it's feeding. I would probably just go on the thing of, if you see them pop up, is either knock them out if you don't like them, I could knock them out the ground and put them in the bin, or embrace it and just look like and tell people you've got aliens in the garden. Because for anyone that doesn't know, the stink horns, also known as the stinking hornwort, is a thing that comes up after rain. It's feeding in your mulch and the decaying leaf litter in the ground. They pop up and all of a sudden they look like an octopus laying on its back with red tentacles with a browny grey sludge in the middle. And the browny grey sludge is where the stink name comes from, because it's trying to attract flies. That's its way of spreading spores. So it smells like rotting meat, so that the flies come and land thinking they're going to get something. They get a little bit, but they're getting covered in spore, which they then fly off. And then when they land somewhere else, they drop their spore, which then starts feeding in the leaf litter again. There is no other way of getting rid of them apart from removing all that mulch. So I'd probably say, live with them. I probably would. Okay, next one I'm going to have a look at is I'm going to download. Weed 6. Okay, I think it might be the same one, because it's the same file name and the same file size. So I have a feeling that's come up twice. So I'll say no to that one. Okay, weed 2. Let's cancel that. Weed 2. Let's have a look and see. Save. Let's see what this is. This is exciting. It's like playing weed roulette. It's also, I like this because it's testing the grey matter. I'm a trivia buff and I always like making sure that my brain gets good exercise. Oh, that's the second flower from Inez as well. That's what it looks like close up. And I will share the screen. Here we go. Now, some of these sometimes take a little bit of imagination. Sometimes it's more pronounced than others. But the reason it's called cider rhomboidea or rhombifolia, I think in this case, is because the leaf is slightly rhomboid shaped. It does take a little bit of imagination on this one because this one's got a bit of rounded ones, but they generally, on some plants, it's really pronounced how rhomboid shaped they are. But this is just what the tip of it looks like close up. So Inez, if you're wanting to know, that one is Paddy's lucerne or cider, S-I-D-A rhombifolia. Asparagus fern, Paul. Okay. It depends on the asparagus ferns. Some you need to get the crown on the plant. That's the common asparagus that's prickly that grows on the ground. You need to get the crown out and not the bulbs. Okay, now with asparagus ferns, some people, if you're digging around them, you'll find these little fluid-filled balls under the ground. Some asparagus species, they can reshoot from those, like potatoes, if you can imagine. Others, like the ground asparagus, can't. They're just purely water holding. So what it is, I would recommend is there's a really good YouTube channel called Pitwater Eco Warriors. And they've done a whole series on how to control the different types of asparagus. And you'll see yours truly doing one particular one called asparagus scandens or snakevine. And so different ones have different ways that you've got to treat them. So I would recommend having a look at that because it's, unless I know the exact type, you've really got to know the ones. I also will say is that a lot of them do get prickles on them. Do yourself a favor, wear thick gloves when you're handling them. For some reason, they get infected really easy and we don't know why. I don't think they've ever actually isolated if there's a chemical or a bug or a bacteria or something, but they get infected very, very easily. Okay, Jan says, can I dig out pennywort? I have it in my raised veggie patch and I don't want to poison it. You can, but you don't pull the leaves up. You've got to run your fingers down, particularly if it's a veggie garden, the soil should be nice and loose. Run your fingers down and you'll find a horizontal stem running along, and that's the actual bit that you've got to get. So if you can, go down, find where that is and slowly keep digging along it and tracing it back and pulling that out. The more of that you can get out, then you won't need to use chemical. It is fairly labor intensive, and you'll find that it'll dive and go under things and wrap around roots, and get as much as you can out, put the garden back to normal, and then when bits resprout, follow and chase those. It can be done, it just takes a long time, but that's the bit. A lot of people just pull out the leaves and you'll end up with what looks like a round leaf with a stalk running down but nothing at the bottom of it. That's where it attaches to the stem. You need to get that underground stem, also called a rhizome. So that's what you've really got to get to. I've got another photo here to download. Let's have a look at this one. Hopefully my internet's going to let me do that. Open folder. Here we go. Oh, that's the one that was shared before. I'll just share it again so you can see what I'm talking about. There we go. That's what I was mentioning before. That's Ochna. That's the one that actually you can just see one on here. Just on the towards the left-hand side, you'll see a bit of red with 2 green berries attached. And it's starting to do its changing to what people think is usually the flower. But in fact, the yellow one is the flower. They just don't hang around in the plant very long at all. I've had people swear blind to me, no, it does not get yellow flowers. It only gets these red things. And I'm going, okay. And then when I show them photos, oh yeah, well, that is the right one. Okay. If that grass is growing amongst plants, e.g. the Monday grass, how do you mulch to get rid of it? Mondo grass. I'd say that was an autocorrect. Mondo grass. If you can, basically you bunch the plants up and then mulch right around those other Mondo grass, etc., and then put the newspaper around them. But the problem is that with all these things is there's no easy answers. You may find it popping up in between the Mondo, then you just have to dig down and pop it out and like keep tracing it back. But wherever you've got any bare ground, as much as possible, get in there and do it. If it's in totally amongst Mondo and it's not in clumps and it's growing everywhere, it may, if it's really bothering you, and it is very labor intensive, is dig up as much as you can, separate out the Mondo grass, dig the weed out, do all of that, like dig it all over, and then replant your Mondo in there again. And that does plant very well from individual plantlets and sprigs. That's actually sometimes a good way of doing it because you're getting fresh growth. Over time, Mondo grass can start getting a bit tussocked and a bit old and some of the leaves look a bit ratty. This is a way of encouraging new growth and getting a lush new area. And if you can give the Mondo a bit of fertilize and get it going, eventually it can get very thick, and actually it does suppress a lot of other weeds as well. Creeping Jenny. Oh, okay. AF wants to know how to can AF please message me or email me at weeds@centralcoast.newsouthwales.gov.au, because Creeping Jenny, we've only got one area and it's actually escaped and it's growing. It's a bit of a concern. Over in Springfield, it started off in someone's garden, went out into the street drain, which we're still trying to treat it. It's now gone down the drain and it's growing in a wetland that is tidally inundated twice a day, growing in the roots of mangroves, and the salt is not bothering it. And it's growing in full shade there. And in other words, it's in full sun, and we're a bit concerned about it. Yeah, I really like to talk because we're still trying to work out the best way of controlling it because we're learning at the same time. So I'd be really interested to see what you've got, where you've got it, and see what you've been doing on it too. So if you could email me, AF, I really appreciate that. Oxalis in lawns. Okay, now, depends on which oxalis. If it's the little tiny one that gets the little yellow flowers and the little leaves that are more of a maroon sort of color, okay, those ones, it depends on your species of lawn for a start with. There's a couple of different lawn species. Generally, everything except for buffalo, so cooch and Queensland blue cooch and kikuyu can all be classed as one type, and buffalo is something else. Buffalo, unfortunately, really acts like a broadleaf weed itself. So anything you generally spray on it, you can also hurt your buffalo. There are products called Clavoxyl, which is quite good on doing that for doing the creeping oxalis. Another one is get out there on a dewy morning or after rain, or even just lightly hose the lawn and get out there with either sulfate of ammonia or iron sulfate. And you sprinkle that on where you've got the weed and it sticks to the leaf. It burns it in the area. It also encourages the grass to grow thicker and to crowd it out. But it is quite effective. That's when you buy, if you buy the weed and feed in a bag rather than the spray on, that is what's in there. So you can also just buy it in bigger bags from rural produce shops as well. And the big ones, lantana and privet, says Leslie. Okay, well, lantana, easiest way of controlling that one is to rip it out where possible. It's very shallow rooted. If you can rip it out, please do so. Sometimes with the bigger ones, it may take a chain and a four-wheel drive or a tractor, depending on what land you're on. Privet is a lot tougher. Cut, if they're small ones, just pulling them out if they're any little ones. Otherwise, cut and paint with glyphosate is very effective. Really big ones, drill and inject. There is a weeds website called Sydney Weeds, and they've some great videos on there on how to actually do these control techniques, rather than me going into here, because we would be here all day. And they're very effective on that. So the problem is that they are so widespread and common. That's why they're not listed, because there is no chance that anyone will ever control them over on a large scale. Yes, on a small individual block you can, but the problem is we're talking landscape wide, and on a lot of properties we could almost bankrupt people if they really had to get rid of it. And council's the same. We're in the same boat with everyone else. But cut and paint, they are, if you have animals and you're going to be cutting it down, cut the branches off and put them in the paddock first. You'll be surprised. Horses, cattle, even sheep, goats absolutely love it and will strip the leaves off it. It's a high protein feed. Wintergrass. Well, you could do like some people do. Peter asked about wintergrass. You can embrace it. Some people actually embrace it because it's green and it keeps the lawn green during winter. Other people can't stand it. Funny enough, a lot of golf courses love it because it keeps the fairways looking great during winter. There are specific herbicides for it. I'd probably talk to your nursery. It depends, because there's been quite a few coming and going over the time, but there's a few out at the moment. I'd have a talk to your nursery and just say, what's the best thing you've got for it? But the main thing to remember with wintergrass is you've got to treat it when it's young before it sets seed. A lot of people spray it when they see the seed and they've noticed it, by which time you're killing the plant, but all the seeds are going to drop. You're better off catching it when it's early, before it sets seed, and that way you're breaking the cycle of it. Okay, mother of millions. So mother of millions, there's a few different types of ones of them. The main thing I would say is when you're dealing with them is wear gloves. Some people react to them. When you're working, if you've got it, if you can, put a bit of paper or an old tarp or an old sheet around where you're working. And the reason is they're called mother of millions because every single little part of the plant that breaks off can start a whole new plant, and they set seed. So by putting sheets down when you're working on them, any bits that drop off are going to land on the sheet. You can then gather them up and put them in the bag and throw them out. Because if you don't do that, they're going to land on the ground, and you'd be surprised how fast a small infestation can become a big infestation. If you have cattle, particularly make sure that you either fence it off from them or just don't let them get on there or control it. And the reason is, if cattle eat it, they generally don't eat it deliberately. It's normally because it's in amongst grass. But what I'd say is that you got to get rid of it because it can poison them. It can occasionally kill them, but usually it causes paralysis in the hindquarters, which then eventually, because they can't get up, leads to death as well. And it was Mondo grass. That's good. Oh, thank you for putting up my weeds at my email address. Thank you. So, so that was with Creeping Jenny. Okay, I'd like if you could send me a photo, because just to make sure that we're talking about the same plant. That's the other thing is with common names, is that sometimes common names have quite a few different plants, and sometimes some plants have quite a few different common names. But a good example is I started in weeds in 1995, and people are talking about, and I'll be honest, people are talking about Patterson's curse, and I'm going, what? Now, you're probably laughing at me going, a weed officer that didn't know Patterson's curse. But I'd never grown up knowing it as that. My mother was from South Australia. I grew up knowing it as Salvation Jane. That's what it's known as, and that's what I never heard it referred to as. So some plants sometimes can have different names and you might not know. That's why we generally try to either get photos, and we use botanical names. We use a common name, but usually a botanical name after it, because plants have one botanical name. And that way, weed officers, if we're talking about something, I might say to another weed officer, oh, look, I'm covered in Bidens, and they'll know exactly what I mean. But if I said to you, oh, I'm covered in cobbler's tax. You might not know that, but you might go, oh, they're farmers' friends, or witches' brooms, or sticky beaks, or cobbler's pegs, or cobbler's tacks, and a whole lot of different names for it. That's probably about the one plant that's got the most amount of common names for it. But when we're talking amongst with plants, we say Bidens, we know immediately what we mean because there's one name for it, Bidens pilosa. And believe it or not, you know those ones that stick to your socks when you go walking? There was a whole movement a few years ago of people trying to say that it's actually a native. Believe it or not. And the reason for it was, here's a little bit of a thing for you. It was actually found in Joseph Banks's collection from New South Wales, from Stingray Harbour, which is now Botany Bay. It's actually in his herbarium collection that he collected there. Now, there's a few posited theories. One is that he mixed it up and he collected it somewhere else. I don't believe that personally, because Joseph Banks, they reckon, was extremely good with record keeping. That was highly unlikely to have happened. The next thing is they say that it is a native, but it was just very, very small and niche in an area and then it took off. I don't believe that either, because nearly every native plant in Australia has something that eats it, whether it be a fungus, whether it's an insect or a bat or a possum or something. Nothing eats this. There is no natural biocontrol for it. This is my logic. When Cook turned up, you know, not long after him, up came La Perouse very, very soon afterwards. Now, what's to say that someone hadn't been there before Cook and Banks? So they went and took their boats and took their tents to the nearest spot that they could find that was level and open, a bit grassy. And that's where supposedly it was found. Now, if another lot of white explorers came in earlier, say maybe Portuguese, Dutch, maybe someone else, I don't know, had gone in there and set their tents up, they would set them up pretty much usually in the same area. And I can't imagine back then that people would have got there in their boats and before they got out the boats went, hang on, we better brush the tents down before we set them up. We don't want to be spreading weeds around. I can't imagine in those times that was even a thought. So I'd say that someone else had got there, put up a tent, the seeds had come off. It's a nice open sunny area near water. It took off, he collected it. I'd say that's how it got here, but I don't think it's native. But I just thought that was an interesting little diversion on it. Oh, you saw it, yes, about the privet, the wallabies feeding on it. Yeah, it doesn't kill it. Something funny that the landholders, not funny, but I think it's great, landholders do up in the valleys in the Yarramalong, Duralong area. During droughts, they will go down near the creeks, they'll get the privets and they'll cut through 2/3 the way through the trunk and lean them over into the paddock so they're still attached to the roots. And what happens is in will come the livestock and they will strip it. They'll eat the leaves, the bark, and all the thin twigs right back to the branches and the trunk. And then when it resprouts, because they're so deep rooted, they're always going to get water. There's always some water in the bottom of those creeks, and the privet's going to get that. So they continually, the animals will strip them, they'll move them to another paddock, let them feed on more privet there, and they'll move them around. And then when the drought breaks and the grass starts coming back, they'll go around, cut those bits off, pile them up, burn them, and then let the plant resprout for next time. And that is one of their ways of bit of drought-proofed fodder. So, and the animals can eat it when it's flowering, when it's not, with no ill effect. And they actually do quite well on putting on weight on it because it's actually a high protein feed, which is why if you ever walk through a paddock and there's privet in the paddock, you'll find it's stunted and chewed back because it's continually being stripped. So they do actually like the privet. Have we got any other questions? I don't think I've missed any pictures. No?
I think that might be it.
Okay.
I think we've covered, you've covered heaps. There's lots and lots of weeds out there that, especially in my garden. So
you're not the only one. Believe it or not, the weed officer has weeds in his garden too, because he gets them at the end of the day and looks at it and goes,
no, not more.
The one I battle is actually a grass called Ehrhata, and it is a pain, and I keep on it as much as I can, and but it does still get away from you because it's like the cobbler's kids never have shoes, the builder's house is never finished. Yeah, I make sure that I don't have any bad weeds. I make sure that I don't have any priority weeds, particularly, funnily enough, my grass out the front and where I park my car is very clean. And the reason is I monitor that strongly because I go on and off a lot of properties, and we will quite often, if we go through and we believe we may have got something on the vehicle, we'll either stand there, brush it down, brush the tyres, do all of that, or we'll go to one of our nearest depots and we'll get the hose out and we'll wash the vehicle underneath and all around the wheels and the wheel arches. But coming home at the end of the day, I just don't want things to get here and me spread them on again. So I monitor it and very careful with that. That's one spot of my house, my yard, that is very clean, is where the vehicle gets parked. And I just really don't want to be responsible for someone else copying something and me being the cause of it, because my job is to stop that.
Yeah, but weeds are very tricky and very invasive by their very nature and very strong.
Yes.
So I've got a bit of work to do in the garden. I don't know about anybody else, but I will get out there and get started now the weather's
Take the
nice.
beautiful weather and take the lockdown time and take advantage in the garden. Get out there, as she says in the ad, maybe get out there with a cup of tea or maybe a cup of hard tea, whatever it takes. Get out there, enjoy it.
Okay, well, I think we've reached the end. We've got lots of thank yous coming in the chat bar there, and some people saying it's very much more effective to view the photos rather than just hear about them on the radio. So we'll definitely have you back again for sure. And if anybody has any questions, you can email Paul at weeds@centralcoast.nsw.gov.au.
Yep.
That's right, isn't it? Yeah.
It is.
I was reading the thing at the bottom and it's not keeping up with me. Or you can give the library an email as well too. So library@Central Coast, same ending to it, and we can forward on any requests that you have. And enjoy your garden, everybody. Enjoy getting out there and having fun. And thanks for taking the time today.
And also don't forget, every fortnight, Weeds Wednesday on Council's Facebook page. We have a little post up for that. And I also can be reached at Paul the Weeds Guy at Facebook as well.
Thank you so much, Paul.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. See you. Bye. Thanks for coming, everyone.